Well, let's start this morning in the courtroom where a Muskogee County jury handed down a not guilty verdict in a murder trial late last night. The case involves two Columbus men dating the same woman.
That's right. The jury has found Quincy Wade not guilty of felony murder, malice murder, aggravated assault, and home invasion. In September of 2021, according to police, Quincy Wade was arrested in LaGrange and charged with the murder of 26-year-old Maurice Vaughn Jackson.
What would you do if the father of your unborn child showed up uninvited, furious, armed, and certain you betrayed him? It's past 2 a.m. in a small Georgia apartment. 3 people are crammed into a narrow bathroom. The door is locked. One man crouches behind the shower curtain, silent, holding his breath. Another man is outside, kicking the door with everything he's got. He's bleeding already, but still coming. Then the door bursts open. Gunfire explodes in a space barely big enough to turn around. Shell casings hit tile. 8 shots from each man. 2 pistols jam. One man is hit in the chest and collapses. Another limps away with blood running down both legs. A pregnant woman stands frozen between them. But here's the thing. Both men claimed the other shot first. Only one survived to tell the story. So the question remains, was this a case of self-defense or something far more personal? Stick with us, because this story doesn't end with a body on the floor. It ends with a courtroom, a stunned jury, and a verdict that left everyone asking, did he deserve to die? Before we jump in, what state or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We've got an incredible global audience here at True Crime Stories Chronicles, and we love hearing where you're tuning in from. Let me know if you want an alternate tone, more intense, more emotional, or more cinematic. Maurice Vaughn Jackson was 26 years old when his life was cut short. But to understand the weight of that loss, you have to understand who he really was, not just the headlines, not just another victim. Maurice was the kind of man people described with words like respectful, quiet, and dependable. The type who didn't seek drama, didn't chase conflict, and certainly didn't expect to find himself in the middle of one. He was family-oriented, close to his relatives, and always showed up when it counted. No one imagined he'd end up caught in the crosshairs of someone else's chaos. At the time, he worked at a solar farm, gritty, honest work, the kind that demands discipline and focus. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And it was there, in the middle of long days under the sun, that he met someone who would change the trajectory of his life. Channa Powell. Powell was a coworker. At first, things were casual. Small talk, shared laughs, the kind of bond that grows naturally when you spend hours around the same people. But over time, their connection deepened. While Powell would later insist they weren't officially a couple, they had become close. Very close. They were spending more time together, sharing meals, and eventually, Maurice invited her into one of the most personal parts of his life, his family. Labor Day weekend in 2021 felt like a fresh chapter. Powell joined Maurice at a family cookout, a small but telling gesture that said, "You matter enough to meet the people who raised me." His relatives welcomed her. They laughed, ate, played music. To them, it looked like the beginning of something solid. Maurice, by all accounts, was happy. There was no outward sign that anything was off. No sign that something was building in the background, something Powell hadn't fully shared. She had a complicated past with another man. A man she was still tied to. A man who wasn't ready to move on. That weekend, as Maurice cracked jokes with cousins and loaded up a plate of barbecue, he probably had no idea that the woman beside him had history with someone who wouldn't let go. To understand the storm Maurice Jackson was unknowingly walking into, you have to go back. Back to the man who had already laid claim to Channa Powell long before Maurice came into the picture. To the outside world, Quincy Tyrek Wade was just another young man trying to figure life out. But behind closed doors, his story with Channa Powell was tangled in chaos, control, and violence that escalated to terrifying levels. Powell and Wade had been involved in a volatile relationship, one that wasn't just messy, but outright dangerous. Not just raised voices or slammed doors. Their dynamic teetered between emotional breakdowns and physical harm, fueled by jealousy, insecurity, and a toxic need for dominance. Quincy Tyrek Wade wasn't just an ex-boyfriend. He was volatile, possessive, and dangerous. It was more than friction. It was abuse, and both of them left marks. Powell told authorities that at one point she'd stabbed Wade during a heated altercation after he allegedly kicked her. She claimed it was out of fear, an act of desperation to protect herself. Not long after, Wade shot Powell in the thigh. He didn't just wave a gun around in a threat, he pulled the trigger. That moment defined what their relationship had become: mutual violence, born from dysfunction and distrust. But even after all that, the cord between them hadn't been fully cut. Because now, Powell was 11 weeks pregnant with Wade's child. That reality could have opened the door to healing. Instead, it became the final fuse on an already burning powder keg. Wade didn't view fatherhood as a blessing. He saw it as leverage, an excuse to stay in Powell's life, a reason to assert himself, to monitor her, to control who she was with and where she went. And when he realized she was spending time with Maurice Vaughn Jackson, that's when things began to tip toward madness. Wade didn't take rejection lightly. To him, this wasn't heartbreak, it was humiliation. He hadn't just lost a relationship, he'd been replaced, forgotten, disrespected. Maurice, with his quiet strength and easy smile, represented everything Wade wasn't. He wasn't loud, he wasn't controlling, he wasn't violent. He didn't threaten Powell, he protected her. He welcomed her into his life, brought her around his family, made her feel safe. That alone was enough to inflame Wade's jealousy to new heights. Wade's behavior became more erratic. Powell told investigators he began calling constantly, sometimes apologetic and pleading, other times raging and accusatory. He'd shift in seconds from, "I love you, let's work it out for the baby," to, "You're embarrassing me, how could you do this to me?" He started showing up unexpectedly. He demanded answers about Maurice. He couldn't stand the idea of another man in Powell's world, much less one she clearly cared about. His accusations of infidelity became relentless. No explanation satisfied him. Every time Powell tried to pull back, Wade pushed harder. He began to unravel in plain sight. Friends and family described him as withdrawn, angry, unstable. And Maurice? He was caught in the crossfire of a situation he barely understood. Powell never told him the full extent of her past with Wade. She likely thought it was behind her. But Wade had never really let go. Powell was torn. On one hand, she was trying to move forward with a man who brought her peace. On the other, she was tethered to a man who had hurt her, but who was also the father of her unborn child. It's a position that outsiders rarely understand, but one that many victims of abusive relationships find themselves in. Emotionally trapped, physically cautious, always calculating the safest next move. She tried to create distance. She didn't answer every call. She didn't invite Wade over. She told him about the pregnancy because she felt he had the right to know. But part of her probably hoped it would soften him, that maybe somehow it would stabilize him. But it didn't. It made things worse. Wade's obsession deepened. His messages became more intense. He wasn't pleading anymore. He was fixated. And on September 20th, 2021, all that emotional chaos turned into real-world horror. That morning, Powell was in her friend's apartment. Maurice was there too. It seemed like a quiet start to the day. Powell stepped into the bathroom for a shower. The water ran, the door closed, and that's when Wade showed up. He didn't knock. He didn't shout her name. He came armed. A loaded handgun, 2 knives, and eyes that didn't blink. This wasn't a conversation. This wasn't a visit. This was an ambush. Maurice, somewhere in the apartment, had no idea what was about to unfold. He may have been checking his phone, he may have been getting dressed, he may have been wondering if they had eggs for breakfast. But one thing is certain, he didn't know Quincy Tyrek Wade had already stepped inside. For Maurice Vaughn Jackson, it had been a good day, simple, peaceful. He and Channa Powell had spent time at a family cookout, laughing, eating, taking photos. Maurice introduced Powell to more of his people, another quiet step toward building something real. There was music, conversation, a few jokes about the baby bump that hadn't quite shown yet. Maurice didn't say much about the pregnancy, but he didn't pull away from it either. His presence was steady, solid. Later that evening, Maurice and Powell left the gathering and drove to a friend's apartment. Powell's friend lived nearby, and the plan was to wind down there before calling it a night. Just a few people, hanging out. Nothing loud, nothing wild. But while Powell and Maurice were spending the evening in comfort, Quincy Tyrek Wade's world was boiling over. He knew where Powell was, or at least he thought he did. The calls started, the texts followed. Nothing new, except now they weren't spaced out. They came rapid fire. The messages grew more desperate, demanding, angry. Wade was outside. Powell saw his name flash across the screen and froze. Maurice, already exhausted from the day, didn't think much of it at first. But Powell's expression said it all. This wasn't just an unwanted visit. This was trouble. Her friend quickly locked the apartment door, hoping Wade would cool off and leave. But that didn't happen. Instead, the group retreated into the bathroom, 3 people in a tight space, barely breathing. The bathroom became a makeshift bunker. They shut the door and locked it. Powell and her friend huddled together. Maurice stepped into the bathtub, pulling the shower curtain halfway closed. He didn't say much. He was calm, but he was alert. They listened. Every sound outside was amplified. And then, glass shattered. Wade had broken through the sliding glass patio door and slipped inside the apartment. The air shifted instantly. There was no more guessing. He was there, and he was armed. Footsteps grew louder. The echo of a man pacing, searching. Then silence. And then, he kicked the bathroom door open. It flew off the frame. Powell and her friends screamed. Wade stood in the doorway, breathing heavy, a handgun pointed directly at them. Maurice, still hidden behind the curtain, held his breath. He hadn't been seen yet. He could hear Powell crying, Wade yelling, the panic bouncing off the tile walls. Wade stepped fully into the room. He looked at Powell, looked at her friend, demanded to know why they were hiding, demanded to know if Maurice was there. She didn't answer. But then, a movement, a sound. Something tipped Wade off. He turned to the bathtub, ripped the shower curtain open, and now it was Maurice staring down the barrel. The tension exploded. A scuffle, a flash, a shot. But who pulled the trigger first? That question still haunts everyone who survived the moment. Powell's world collapsed in seconds. She was pinned against the wall, screaming, hands shaking. Her friend ducked down, frozen in fear. One shot rang out, then another, and another. Powell couldn't tell who had been hit first. All she knew was that Wade had fired, and then he was down. Maurice was on the floor too, bleeding, unmoving, blood smeared across the tile. Powell tried to process the image. Wade's gun, Maurice's chest, her friend's screams. Everything blurred. She knelt beside Maurice. He wasn't responding. Wade was gasping, still alive, but hit. Powell reached for her phone, her voice cracking as she called 911. The words tumbled out, raw and desperate. There's been a shooting. He's not breathing. Please, hurry. She didn't know if Maurice was alive. She didn't know if Wade would survive. She didn't even know how it had escalated this far. What she did know was this: nothing would ever be the same. Have you ever witnessed something like this in your neighborhood or city? Let us know in the comments. It helps others realize how close these stories can hit home. After spending a peaceful Labor Day with Maurice's family, Channa Powell and Maurice Vaughn Jackson made their way back to her friend Raquel Polk's apartment on Buena Vista Road. It was just past midnight, about 12:30 a.m., and they were winding down from a long day filled with laughter, music, and togetherness. At the time, nothing seemed unusual. The air was calm. Powell and Jackson likely believed the worst of their problems were behind them. But beneath the quiet, something dangerous was approaching. By 2:30 a.m., Quincy Tyrek Wade, Powell's ex and the father of her unborn child, began calling and texting her incessantly. The tone of the messages was aggressive, erratic. He wasn't just upset, he was building towards something. Minutes later, Wade showed up at the apartment. He didn't knock gently. He banged on the door, demanding to be let in. Powell, sensing his rage and the threat it carried, made a quick decision. She, Jackson, and Raquel Polk rushed into the bathroom, locking the door behind them. Jackson climbed into the bathtub and crouched behind the shower curtain, trying to stay hidden. It was a tense, fearful moment. Then, suddenly, Polk panicked. Overcome with fear, she ran out of the bathroom before anything else could unfold, fleeing the apartment entirely. That left Powell and Jackson alone, sealed inside that small space, waiting in silence. But Wade wasn't leaving. He found an unlocked sliding glass door at the back of the apartment. He let himself in and stormed through the unit until he reached the bathroom. With a single kick, he broke through the bathroom door. He came armed, and he came angry. What happened next remains the center of conflicting accounts. But what's clear is this: it escalated fast. According to Powell's later statement to police, Wade immediately pointed his gun at her head, then at her stomach, and threatened to kill both her and the unborn child. She screamed, and that's when Maurice made the decision to act. Still hidden behind the curtain, he must have realized the danger was now imminent. He pulled it back and revealed himself, confronting the armed man who had once nearly killed Powell. Wade turned to face him. The two men were now staring each other down, both holding 9mm handguns. Then, gunfire. In a flash, both opened fire. 8 rounds each, 16 total. The apartment exploded with the sound of violence. Both guns eventually jammed, adding a terrifying pause in the chaos. By the time it ended, Wade had been hit in both legs. Maurice had been shot 4 times, including a fatal wound to the chest. He collapsed inside the bathroom, gasping, bleeding, dying. Powell was in full-blown panic. But even in the midst of it, her instincts kicked in. She ran after Wade as he stumbled out of the apartment. She managed to grab his jammed handgun and tossed it onto a nearby couch, trying to separate him from the weapon. Then she rushed back into the bathroom. Maurice was still alive, but barely. She grabbed a towel and tried to stop the bleeding, applying pressure to the wound in his chest. She cradled him in her arms, begging him to hold on, praying for some kind of miracle. But it was too late. He died there on the bathroom floor. When police arrived, they found Powell devastated and covered in blood. She was in shock. Her world had collapsed in a matter of seconds. She told investigators that Maurice had never harmed her, that he was gentle, supportive. He was always kind to me, she said through tears. So unlike Wade, who threatens me all the time. It was a story of a man who came to protect and paid for it with his life. Maurice Vaughn Jackson never fired the first shot. He only reacted when it became clear that Powell and her unborn child were in danger. He stepped out of hiding not to confront, but to protect. And for that, he died a hero. After the shooting, the scene inside the apartment on Buena Vista Road was one of sheer devastation. Maurice Vaughn Jackson lay dead in the bathroom. Channa Powell was in shock, covered in blood, still trying to process what had just happened. And Quincy Tyrek Wade, bleeding from both legs, was already on the move. Despite being shot multiple times, Wade didn't wait around. He didn't call for help. He didn't check to see if Maurice was alive or dead. Instead, he limped out of the apartment into the early morning darkness and got into his car. From there, he drove nearly 45 miles south to LaGrange, Georgia, bleeding the entire way. It was a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of what he'd just done. By the time he arrived in LaGrange, Wade was in bad shape. His legs were injured, and he was losing blood rapidly. But instead of heading straight to a hospital, he went to the home of a friend or associate, someone he trusted enough to hide out with. That decision only raised more red flags. Wade's arrival triggered immediate suspicion. He was clearly hurt, and his story didn't add up. When someone finally did call for medical help, Wade's roommate attempted to cover for him, telling investigators that the shooting had taken place in Atlanta, nearly 100 miles from the actual crime scene. It didn't take long for detectives to realize the story was false. Meanwhile, back in Columbus, authorities were already working the crime scene. As they canvassed the apartment and interviewed a shaken Channa Powell, the details started falling into place. Maurice Jackson had died in an apparent shootout with Wade, who had kicked in the bathroom door with a loaded gun. Multiple shell casings littered the floor. Both weapons had been recovered. Blood trails, bullet holes, and shattered fragments told a chilling story. What the police needed now was to find Wade. But Wade had left a literal trail behind. When LaGrange police received word of a man showing up with gunshot wounds, the timelines immediately clicked. Local officers connected the dots and alerted Columbus investigators. They traced the trail of blood from the apartment all the way to Wade's car. The vehicle reeked of gunpowder. Blood stains covered the interior. It was undeniable. This was the car he'd driven away in after the shooting. Wade was quickly taken into custody at the hospital where he was receiving treatment for his injuries. His arrest marked the final step in a manhunt that, thankfully, didn't drag on for days. It was swift, methodical, and it brought a measure of relief to those reeling from Maurice's senseless death. Wade didn't go quietly. Even in custody, he seemed to lack remorse, still trying to minimize his role in what had happened. But the evidence was overwhelming. Authorities officially charged Quincy Tyrek Wade with a list of crimes that reflected the sheer violence of that night. Malice murder felony, murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime, home invasion burglary, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Each charge carried weight, and collectively, they painted a clear picture of a man who had allowed jealousy and rage to drive him to deadly extremes. Back in Columbus, Powell was left to mourn the man who had simply tried to protect her. Maurice Jackson wasn't part of any feud. He hadn't come to Powell's apartment looking for violence. He was just there with someone he cared about, caught in the crosshairs of someone else's obsession. And now, a man who had once been known for his quiet nature, his work ethic, and his love for family, was gone. The arrest brought accountability, but it couldn't bring Maurice back. The courtroom was packed. The weight of what had happened that night in Columbus hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. The family of Maurice Vaughn Jackson sat silently, eyes fixed on the man accused of taking his life. On the other side, Quincy Tyrek Wade appeared composed, dressed in a suit, no visible trace of the chaos he had left behind just months earlier. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They framed Wade as a violent, possessive ex-boyfriend who refused to let Channa Powell move on. A man with a history of threats and outbursts. A man who had previously shot her. A man who entered that Buena Vista Road apartment on a mission. And that mission, they said, was murder. They recounted how Wade had called and texted Powell relentlessly in the early morning hours, how he showed up uninvited, broke in through a sliding glass door, and kicked down a locked bathroom door. They emphasized that he came armed, not just with a 9mm handgun, but also with 2 knives. He didn't come to talk. He came prepared for violence. They painted Maurice Jackson as the innocent party, a soft-spoken, hard-working man who found himself in the wrong place at the worst possible time. A man who had no prior criminal record, a man who had simply tried to protect the woman he cared about. But then the defense stepped in.
Not guilty verdict in a murder trial late last night. The case involves 2 Columbus men dating. Well, let's start this morning in the courtroom where a Muskogee County jury handed down a not guilty verdict in a murder trial late last night.
Happened at Patriot Place Apartments off of Buena Vista Road in Columbus.
Their strategy was to flip the script. They claimed Maurice wasn't the passive victim prosecutors had made him out to be. In fact, they argued it was Maurice who fired the first shot. The defense pointed to the chaos of the scene, the overlapping testimonies, and the forensic details that left just enough ambiguity to question the official version of events. And then came the heart of the defense, Powell's testimony. Under oath, Powell tried to recount what happened. She spoke about the threats Wade made, how he pointed the gun at her head, then at her stomach, where she was carrying Wade's unborn child. She described Maurice revealing himself from behind the shower curtain and the sudden explosion of gunfire that followed. But under cross-examination, her timeline faltered. Some statements she made didn't align with the physical evidence. Other claims conflicted with what she had told investigators earlier. She was emotional, yes, but the defense used that emotion to imply unreliability. The defense pointed out that her close relationship with Maurice could have biased her account. They questioned her memory, her state of mind, and the sequence of events. Was it possible she didn't see who fired first? Was she protecting Maurice's legacy? Even the prosecution couldn't ignore the inconsistencies. Then came the witnesses, neighbors, experts, law enforcement. Some described the scene they heard that night. The loud banging, the gunfire, the screams. One neighbor said they heard a man shout, "Why are you doing this?" just before the shooting started. But who said it, and to whom, remained unclear. The defense hammered home one key theme, reasonable doubt. Yes, Wade broke into the apartment. Yes, he entered the bathroom armed, but was his intent to kill? Or was it to confront? And if he was threatened by another armed man, Maurice, wasn't he allowed to defend himself? The courtroom was split. Emotion battled logic. Grief fought against legal nuance. For Maurice's family, it felt obvious this was murder. For Wade's defense team, it was more complicated. The law, they reminded the jury, didn't demand moral clarity. It demanded proof beyond a reasonable doubt. When the jury returned, the room fell into a hush. One by one, the foreperson read the verdicts. Malice murder, not guilty. Felony murder, not guilty. Aggravated assault, not guilty. Home invasion, not guilty. Burglary, not guilty. Possession of a firearm by a felon, not guilty. Criminal trespass, guilty. That was it. Of the multiple felony charges brought against Quincy Tyrek Wade, each carrying the potential for decades in prison, he was found guilty of just one, criminal trespass, a misdemeanor. He was sentenced to time served and walked out of that courtroom a free man. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Maurice Jackson's family broke down in tears. To them, the verdict wasn't just a legal failure, it was a moral collapse. A young man had been gunned down while trying to protect someone he cared for, and the man responsible would face no real consequences. Channa Powell was speechless. For months, she had lived with the trauma of that night, the weight of witnessing someone die right in front of her. And now, the man who broke into her apartment, kicked down her bathroom door, and exchanged gunfire with her partner, was free. For Wade's attorneys, it was a victory of process. A reminder that the legal system isn't about emotion, it's about evidence. And if the state can't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, then the law demands acquittal. But for many watching the case unfold, the outcome left a bitter taste. How could someone walk away from such carnage with barely a slap on the wrist? How could a man with a history of violence who admitted to being there with weapons face no real prison time? And it left the public asking one heavy question. Was this justice or just another loophole in a broken system? Maurice Vaughn Jackson didn't go looking for trouble. He didn't have a criminal record. He wasn't someone who stirred chaos or sought violence. He worked. He kept to himself. He spent time with his family, and when he met Channa Powell, he saw someone who needed peace, someone who had seen too much of the opposite. But in trying to be a safe place for her, he stepped directly into the path of someone else's storm. Maurice didn't know that opening his heart would cost him his life. What happened that night wasn't a sudden eruption. It was the tragic culmination of a long, dangerous pattern, one that had been building long before Maurice was ever in the picture. Quincy Tyrek Wade had shown signs, clear ones, documented ones. There had been threats, physical violence, a shooting, and yet the system had failed to intervene meaningfully. Too often, red flags in abusive relationships are brushed aside. We call it drama. We say, they'll work it out. We tell victims to just leave, not realizing how impossible that can feel when fear and control are part of the equation. Channa Powell tried to move on. She tried to build a new life. But Wade's obsession, his possessiveness, and his refusal to let go, all rooted in untreated rage, kept pulling her back. And society didn't protect her. No restraining order could erase his access. No warning was loud enough to drown out his determination. And when he broke into that apartment, armed and furious, no one was there to stop him. Maurice became collateral damage in a war he didn't even start. He didn't fire the first shot out of hate or pride. He did it, if at all, to protect a woman he cared for. A woman who was pregnant. A woman trying to live without fear. And still, the courtroom gave no justice. Powell, like many survivors, faced skepticism. Her trauma was picked apart, her timeline scrutinized, her fear questioned, as if surviving wasn't enough. As if the burden was still hers to prove she had been afraid. This story is not just about one man who died or one man who walked free. It's about a system that continually fails to take threats seriously until it's too late. It's about the price paid when we ignore the early signs, when we don't listen to victims, when we dismiss violent behavior as temporary anger or chalk it up to relationship problems. Every day in the US, an average of 3 women are killed by a current or former partner. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men experience severe intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Maurice Jackson didn't deserve to die. But if there's anything we can take from this tragedy, it's this. Red flags aren't just warnings, they're predictors. And when we ignore them, people die. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, don't wait. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE, 7233, or text START to 88788. Help is available. You're not alone. Maurice Vaughn Jackson wasn't just a name and a headline. He was someone's son. A quiet soul who worked long hours at a solar farm, showed up for his family, and simply wanted peace. He didn't chase drama. He didn't invite violence. All he did was care for someone trying to escape a cycle of abuse. And for that, he lost everything.
It's not about who shot first. It's a case about one thing when my son lost his life protecting himself and who he was with that night. When trouble came knocking on their door, their place to stay where they was, mind their business. That's all the case is about.
The most haunting part of this tragedy is that Maurice didn't have to die. His death wasn't the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was the end result of unchecked obsession, ignored warning signs, and a system that didn't intervene until it was far too late. He died in a locked bathroom, on a tile floor, cradled by the woman he had tried to protect. A fatal bullet to the chest silenced a man who wasn't looking for a fight, just a future. And in the end, the person who kicked in the door, who entered with a loaded weapon, who had a long history of violence, walked free. There's a tragic irony here. Wade said it was self-defense. Prosecutors said it was murder. But the jury's verdict left a hole in the hearts of those who knew Maurice, and left many wondering, how much evidence is enough? How loud do the red flags have to be before someone finally listens? Now we want to know your thoughts. What do you think really happened that night? Should Wade have gone free? Comment your take below. We want to hear your verdict. Your voice matters. These aren't just stories, they're real lives and real lessons. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you think it's time we stop ignoring the warning signs, if you want to help shine a light on the tragedies that still go unanswered, subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles. Because some cases don't just stay in the headlines, they stay with us.